This week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to This Week in the Boardroom. I'm Scott Cutler, Executive Vice President with NYSE Euronext, and today's show is focused on board evaluations. And as my guest today, I'm joined by my colleague, TK Kerstetter, President of Corporate Board Member. TK, welcome as a guest on the show.
This is always was sort of like cheating when I just move seats so that I can be the guest on this, but it's a pleasure to be on the show, Scott.
Yes, so I don't we can dispel with any of the backgrounds or introductions. Hopefully our viewers have a sense of your importance in the dialogue today. So with board evaluations, why are board evaluations an important topic for corporate governance?
I know you know the answer to that, but I appreciate that you would set me up on that. But primarily, you're looking at improving the performance and effectiveness of the board. I mean, we evaluate everything else and should evaluate everything else, and there's no reason that we shouldn't evaluate the board. And as you know very well, the exchange recognized the importance of this in their listing requirements. It's a requirement of an NYSE company to do a board evaluation. At NASDAQ, it is recommended, it is not required. And the last that I saw with current research out there, 94% of companies actually do a board evaluation now. So that is creeping up, and I think it will continue to creep up on that. So when you look at evaluation and effectiveness, you're looking at composition and sort of committee structures. You're looking at how your board materials are, what's your agenda like, is it effective? You're looking at governance guidelines that your company has and how the board interacts with those. You're looking at shareholder relations. You're looking at relations between the board and management and the board and CEO. So there is just a plethora of information that will help you be a better board by conducting board evaluation.
To me, the point is really that the board and board structure is never static. It has to evolve with the company. It has to evolve with the strategy. And you need to be able to have a mechanism by which you're assessing really the impact and decision-making of every individual who plays a role on the board. But in practice, what options do companies have in actually conducting that board evaluation?
Well, you had mentioned options, and I think that that's important. First of all, there's sort of a self-evaluation. There's a board member, evaluating themselves. Okay, somebody may give them questions to ask themselves. Nobody's really keeping track of that. Nobody's doing anything. It's still a good thing to do because you should be asking yourself, am I missing meetings? Am I prepared for meetings? There's all those questions. So that's an option. It's really something that I would suggest that people do on a periodic basis. It doesn't really fit the goal of the NYSE. When you're looking at those evaluations, you're looking at the opportunity to evaluate individuals. You're looking to evaluate the board as a whole, okay? And then you have the opportunity to do peer-to-peer, okay? And peer-to-peer is where if you and I sat on the board together, in certain categories you would be rating me. So if you felt, for example, that I came to the meetings unprepared and stuff like that, I wouldn't know that you as another director specifically said that of me,
right.
But I would know collectively of how the other directors felt about my contribution on the board. And there is nothing that changes behavior more in board evaluations than peer-to-peer. At the same time, that can damage the collegial atmosphere on some boards. So I wouldn't necessarily rush out there and go to peer-to-peer, but I would certainly have a goal at the company to try and get to that point where my board was comfortable enough to do that.
Whose direct responsibility is it to assess board structure, performance of board, and then secondly, who actually conducts the the actual evaluation?
Yeah. The responsibility is, one would say, is sitting either in the chair of the NomGov committee or in the chairman of the board, okay? It could, in some companies, also be the lead or presiding director, okay? It's going to be typically in one of those places. It depends. If the chairman is also the CEO, most likely that's being pushed.
But it is typically identified as an individual who's responsible for that, or a committee.
You know, at some point in time, I think it has to come back to the individual. You know, sometimes it's the NomGov committee. In their charter, they will have responsibility for that because they're looking at composition. They're looking at a lot of the issues. So the board evaluation helps them do the analysis of where they are today. So that's important. But when you talk about conducting it, you know, who has responsibility from it on the top of the house and who's conducting it is two different things. I'll start by saying who shouldn't, in my mind, be conducting it, and that is the head of the nominating committee, you know, or somebody on that committee, or the chair. And the reason, and this happens out there, and I know people are not going to be happy to hear that I'm saying this, but to me, if the chair of the nominating committee or the chairman of the board is one of the problems, you know, you don't have much independence that the response is coming in if that's who's doing the evaluation. I certainly wouldn't be probably taking shots at somebody, you know, if they're the ones that are doing the evaluation. So I like to make sure that it's not somebody that's also going to be filling out the survey. So the next logical person, the most common person in companies, ends up being the GC or the corporate secretary. Still, you have a little more independence. You don't have clean independence, though. It's you know, it puts them in an awkward position if a problem is presented, or there may even be issues with agendas and stuff that somebody wants to complain about, which come under the purview of the corporate secretary, maybe. So that independence isn't perfect, but in solution to the problem of paying every year or paying a lot to bring a third party in, I think that's a much better solution than having a board member themselves do it. And then lastly, you bring a third party expert in, and there's varied people out there that can do that. Obviously that's more expensive, but there at least you're getting the independence. I would recommend that at least, at minimum, you have an independent facilitator every third year, say. It'd be nice if you had it every other. They do come around very quickly, meaning that all of a sudden the next one's here. So I can see why you would want to take a shortcut on 1 year, but boy, at some point in time, you have to have that independent.
Yeah. What are the do's and don'ts beyond just the individual that you're going to choose for conducting the evaluation?
Well, first of all, there's a couple ways to do it. You can do it by questionnaire, okay? You can do it by interview. People like interviews because there's no paper trail to the interview, okay, even though somebody may be taking notes relative to that. The questionnaire can either be online or it can be paper. Online certainly is convenient, but we have often heard that nothing on online ever disappears, and this is something that you really want to disappear. Not from any kind of fraudulent way. It's a best practice to make sure when that is done that all the records are all the responses are destroyed, and you're left with an action plan, which we'll talk about in a minute. So that's clearly a do and do. Action plan. You want to boil all that down with something that you can put in the board minutes, okay? And what's very important with that page, okay, of what you're going to do is if you say you're going to do that, you got to do it, because the last thing you want to do is put in your minutes that this is what we're going to do, and then you as a board don't do that. You're just setting yourself up for some criticism or some liability going forward. So that becomes critical. And then again, this independent party thing is just something that we need to do.
Well, last, looking into the future, what's the trend? How do you see this developing?
Well, I'm going to answer this, and then I'm going to throw it back to you to answer. But there's two things that are trends to me. One is peer-to-peer, which I mentioned, and I think that's going to continue to grow because that is the most effective way to do it. Something on the horizon that I hope doesn't come that worries me a little bit is I'm seeing shareholders interested in the transparency of the evaluations, okay? And, we're seeing so much transparency. They want that as another tool to say, should I be reelecting this director or not? I think that is thin ice. It starts to, again, become what I consider too much transparency. I'm afraid it's going to destroy board evaluations in the long run, the effectiveness of them, because people now be too guarded or too sensitive.
But on that point, today shareholders will know what percentage of the meetings that a board director will attend, and clearly, if you don't, certainly under ISS policies, you'll get a no vote recommendation if you were just an inactive board member. Number one, and then number two, obviously shareholders, to the extent that it's part of the charter and part of the disclosed process that the board actively conducts this type of evaluation, should at least be the standard in terms of your communication with shareholders that we're doing that work.
Yeah. One of the things I would say is, if you do this, communicate out the effectiveness of doing it. We try and keep these things sort of under wraps. In that proxy or on your website, you should be saying we have a robust evaluation process. Hey, here's what we do, and disclose that that's what you do. It's not time to harbor those things back to the office. It's time to let the world know, and shareholders, investors know, hey, this is a process that we go through, and we think it's pretty valuable.
Well, thanks, TK. I think your insight has been fantastic, and for those tuning in, we hope you've learned some input and gotten some perspective on how to think about board evaluations going forward. From my perspective, this is something that is always important. You cannot actually manage what you're not measuring. And I think the importance of the board and the involvement of strategy and direction is truly important for all boards to consider. So we thank you for tuning in this week, and tune in next time for another topic that will be important for you as a director or a board or committee member. Thank you.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.